The first time anyone heard the cries, they thought it was just the wind curling through the treetops. In the woods outside the settlement, sound behaved strangely, words stretched, whispers tangled in the branches, but these cries were different. They carried a tremble that made even the bravest men pause mid-stride, as though the forest itself was trying to hush them. By the time the villagers traced the soft, pained noises back to the small cabin by the creek, the girl inside had already locked her doors and extinguished her lantern, insisting that no one come near her after dusk. She was only 17, slight and pale, a girl who rarely spoke to anyone. Yet one morning she stood in the center of the settlement with trembling hands pressed against her abdomen, telling them she was carrying something she could not explain. She swore she had lived untouched, that her virtue was unquestioned, but something inside her was growing all the same. They dismissed her as delusional until the oldest midwife in the settlement placed a hand upon the girl's stomach and felt the unsettling shift beneath her skin, rapid, skittering, deliberate, as though a creature within had felt the midwife's touch and recoiled. No one knew what to believe. Some whispered illness. Others whispered sin. But behind closed doors, where lamps flickered low and the night pressed against thin walls, many admitted they had heard the cries coming from the woods before the girl ever spoke a word. Cries like an infant's, but not quite. Too hollow. Too knowing. When the doctor arrived several days later, weary from his journey and annoyed at being dragged into mountain hysteria, he expected to find a frightened girl exaggerating a simple ailment. But the moment he stepped into her cabin, he felt a heaviness in the air, as though the shadows crept closer just to listen. The girl sat trembling on the edge of her bed, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the dark corner of the room where something unseen seemed to breathe with her. And when he finally touched her abdomen, the movement beneath her skin froze him where he stood, numbing his fingertips and hollowing his chest with the cold certainty that whatever he had been called to examine was not a child, not a sickness, and not something meant for human hands to deliver. The cries from the forest grew louder that night. And deep inside the girl, something answered. The villagers had grown used to the girl's quiet presence long before she ever uttered her strange claim. She moved like a shadow between the cabins, offering shy nods but rarely speaking, a figure so unobtrusive that people often forgot she lived among them at all. Perhaps that was why her sudden announcement struck them with such force. It was as if a silent tree had suddenly found a voice. She stood in the chill morning air, fingers clasped tightly over her abdomen, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment, and told them she believed she was carrying a child. Her voice trembled, cracked, and yet held a strange conviction, the kind that made onlookers shift uncomfortably on their feet. They asked the obvious questions, their faces stiff with disbelief, for she had always been alone, always kept her distance, and never shown even the slightest interest in courting. Yet she repeated it again and again, insisting she had never been touched, never shared a bed, never so much as allowed a man to hold her hand. Her innocence was not just a claim, it was a fact the entire settlement would have sworn to. But what unsettled them most was the way she described what she felt. She said it wasn't like anything the midwives had taught their daughters or anything she had ever overheard from the married women who whispered about pregnancies by the communal fire. There was no warmth, no gentle fluttering, no soft movement beneath her ribs. What she felt was cold, deliberate, and strangely sentient, as though whatever lived inside her had been placed there with intention rather than born of natural processes. She described the sensation as a creeping pressure that sometimes shifted abruptly, causing her breath to catch and her vision to blur, almost like a hand pushing outward from within. The villagers exchanged glances at this, half convinced she was suffering from madness brought on by isolation. But madness could not account for the pallor of her skin or the deep shadows under her eyes, nor could it explain the way her body seemed subtly altered, tightened, as if bracing against something beneath the surface. Rumors began to spread with the speed of wildfire. Some said she was cursed, others whispered she had been visited by something unholy in the dead of night, while a few insisted she was simply seeking attention after years of loneliness. But beneath all their speculation lingered a gnawing unease, one none of them dared voice aloud. It wasn't the girl they feared, it was the possibility that she was telling the truth, and that something unknown had found its way into her body without her consent or comprehension, leaving her trapped between terror and incomprehensible mystery that no prayer or remedy seemed capable of soothing. The first whispers drifted through the woods long before anyone admitted hearing them. At dusk, when the sun bled out behind the ridgeline and the settlement fell into that uneasy stillness between evening chores and nightfall, strange sounds began to ripple through the trees. At first these noises blended with the usual hush of the forest, owls calling from their perches, branches creaking under their own weight, the wind pushing through layers of pine and cedar. But these new sounds were softer, thinner, and laced with a trembling note that didn't belong to any creature the villagers knew. They resembled the faint cry of a newborn, but carried an uncanny quality that made the hairs at the back of the neck stand upright, as if the forest were attempting to mimic a human infant without fully understanding how such a sound should be shaped. The villagers tried to ignore it at first. They had long since learned that the woods held secrets, and it was safer not to pry. Still, on nights when the wind died and the sky darkened so much the trees formed black silhouettes against the horizon, the cries grew clearer. Some said they floated just above the ground, others insisted they rose from high among the branches, and a few believed the sound circled the settlement slowly, as though searching for something, or someone. Children were dragged indoors earlier than usual, livestock penned tightly, and lanterns burned later into the night, their shaky glow a shield against whatever lurked beyond the tree-line. Curiosity soon turned to dread when a handful of men ventured out to investigate. They followed the faint cries, lanterns swinging in nervous hands, but each time they thought they were getting closer, the sound shifted direction, slipping deeper into the forest with an eerie playfulness. The woods seemed to swallow the noise and release it somewhere else, creating the unsettling impression that the cries were not moving naturally but were instead echoing through the trees with intention. By the time the men returned, pale-faced and empty-handed, they refused to speak openly about what they thought they had heard, a second voice hidden beneath the infant-like wail, something lower, older, and undeniably aware. What troubled the villagers most was the direction the cries always came from. Without fail, every night, the sound drifted from the part of the forest where the girl's cabin stood alone. It was as if the woods were pointing toward her, drawing an invisible line between the eerie noises and the strange burden growing within her body. Some of the villagers began to avoid her path during the day, glancing toward the trees with wary eyes, convinced the cries were not merely sounds but warnings. And as the nights grew colder and the echoes more persistent, an unspoken belief settled over the settlement, that whatever haunted the forest had taken notice of the girl long before she ever felt the first unsettling stir inside her abdomen, and it was now calling out for her with a voice that was not human and never had been. When the aging physician finally arrived, he expected nothing more than another case of rural superstition. The letter summoning him had been frantic, dotted with trembling handwriting and vague warnings about a girl who claimed to be with child despite swearing she had never known a man. He had spent decades traveling between small, isolated settlements, treating everything from fevers to frostbite, and he had grown accustomed to the theatrics of frightened communities. But as his horse approached the settlement, he noticed an unease in the air that felt heavier than simple worry. People watched him from behind half-closed shutters, whispering to one another with expressions carved from a mixture of fear and exhaustion. No one greeted him directly. Instead, they simply pointed him toward the girl's lonely cabin as though eager to be rid of the burden they were passing to him. Inside, the dim interior smelled faintly of cold ash and damp wood. The girl sat on the edge of her bed, hunched forward, clutching a worn blanket around her shoulders. She looked younger than he expected, her face gaunt, lips pale, and eyes swollen from sleeplessness. She did not immediately speak when he entered, and the silence between them pulsed with something unsettling. As he approached, she finally lifted her gaze, and he was struck by the hollow terror etched into her expression. She did not look mad, she looked haunted. The doctor began with routine questions, asking about her symptoms, her last cycle, her appetite. Her answers were quiet, halting, but consistent. She insisted again that she had never been touched. Her voice cracked when she said she had begged God to tell her what was happening to her body, but no answer ever came. He dismissed her trembling at first, chalking it up to nerves, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a simple examination. The moment he placed his hand on her abdomen, however, every trace of skepticism drained from him. He expected warmth, a faint swelling, perhaps the flutter of movement. Instead, he felt a sudden rigidity, as though a solid mass had pressed upward to meet his palm. It was cold, shockingly cold, and moved with a precision that made his breath hitch. This was not the soft, rolling motion of a fetus shifting in the womb. It felt more like a creature repositioning itself deliberately, as if aware of his touch and recoiling from it with a kind of intelligence that made his skin prickle. He withdrew his hand instantly, but the sensation lingered, numbing his fingertips and stirring a chill that crept slowly up his spine. For the first time in his long career, he found himself at a loss for explanation. The girl's quiet whimper echoed in the silence, and he realized she was watching him closely, not with hope, but with the resigned dread of someone who already knew he had no comfort to offer. The doctor had barely regained his composure when he noticed the tattered leather-bound journal resting on a small table near the girl's bed. Its edges were frayed, the binding cracked from years of handling, and a thin layer of dust clung to its surface except where a single finger had recently traced along the cover. When he asked about it, the girl hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the darkest corner of the room before she whispered that it had belonged to her mother, who had died when she was only a child. She explained that the journal had been locked away beneath the floorboards until a few nights earlier, when she heard something beneath the cabin shifting, scraping, almost as though it were trying to push upward. Terrified, she pried up the loose board and found the journal lying there as though someone, or something, had left it for her to discover. Curiosity mixed with dread as the doctor opened its brittle pages. The writing was uneven, sometimes sprawling, other times compressed into tight lines, as if the woman had been writing in the dark or while trembling. At first, the entries seemed harmless, the ramblings of a lonely widow isolated in the deep woods. She wrote about sleepless nights, the strange silence of the forest, and the feeling of eyes watching her from the darkness outside her window. But as he read further, the tone of the entry shifted. Her words grew frantic, describing dreams of murmuring voices that seeped into her mind and followed her even after she woke. She wrote of shadows that moved against the grain of lantern light, lingering at the edge of her vision. And then she mentioned something more troubling, an unseen presence she believed lived beyond the settlement, deep in the oldest part of the woods, a presence that she claimed chooses its host when it hungers for connection. The doctor paused at that line, glancing up at the girl. She stared down at her hands, twisting her fingers together as if trying to keep them from shaking. She said her mother had become convinced that something from the forest had followed her home long before she ever gave birth, whispering to her at night and promising to take away her loneliness. The doctor wanted to dismiss it as the product of grief, isolation, or mental decline, but the woman's descriptions bore unsettling similarities to what he himself had felt just moments earlier, the unnatural coldness beneath the girl's skin, the deliberate movement, the sense of a lurking awareness. The girl's first screaming fit came without warning, shattering the fragile calm that had settled over the cabin. The doctor had been turning another page of the mother's journal when the girl stiffened, her fingers digging into the mattress as if trying to anchor herself to the earth. Her breath hitched sharply, and before he could reach her side, a piercing cry tore from her throat, raw and primal, as though the agony surging through her body was tearing its way out. Her back arched violently, her limbs rigid and trembling, and her eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed. The doctor instinctively tried to hold her steady, but her body felt impossibly tense, possessed by a force that seemed far stronger than her frail frame should allow. The air around her seemed to thicken, humming with a pressure that made the lantern flame sputter. What unsettled him most was not her scream, it was the way her abdomen shifted beneath her thin nightdress, moving with a rippling motion that defied every law of nature he had ever known. Something inside her was pushing upward, crawling rather than kicking, sliding against her organs with a slow and deliberate intention. The doctor recoiled as he felt a cold pulse radiate from her skin, like the chill of deep winter seeping through his bones. The girl's hands flew to her temples as she cried out that she could hear voices, not around her but within her, whispering her name, calling to her in a language she did not understand yet somehow feared. Her screams were punctuated by gasping pleas, begging the voices to leave her alone, begging them to stop, insisting that they were not dreams but intrusions. She said the voices were not singular but layered, as though multiple beings were whispering through the same narrow channel, their tones overlapping in a dissonant chorus that clawed at her sanity. The doctor tried to soothe her, insisting her pain was physical, a hallucination brought on by fear or illness, but the moment his hand touched her shoulder, the movement inside her surged violently, as though reacting to his presence. Her breathing turned ragged, shuddering in panic bursts, and her nails scraped against the wooden bed frame as she tried to fight the unseen force that gripped her. When the fit finally subsided, she collapsed in exhausted sobs, trembling uncontrollably. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she whispered that the voices had grown louder with each passing night. They called her by the name her mother used to speak in her gentlest moments, almost tenderly, as though trying to lull her into acceptance. But beneath the tenderness lurked something cold and ancient, something that did not plead but commanded, urging her to surrender to whatever lived within her body and listen from the darkness beyond the walls of her cabin. Further entries revealed that the mother believed the presence had once tried to claim her, but she resisted it. She feared it would return someday. The changes in the girl's body began slowly at first, subtle enough that the doctor tried to explain them away with clinical reasoning. But each passing day chipped away at any illusion that what grew within her belonged to the natural world. Her abdomen did not swell outward in the familiar roundness of pregnancy, instead, it tightened as though something inside were pulling inward, coiling closer to her spine rather than expanding toward the surface. When she breathed, small tremors rippled beneath her skin, short, darting movements that felt too coordinated, too intentional, like the shifting of a creature testing the limits of its confinement. At night, when the lantern dimmed and the shadows deepened, those movements intensified. The girl would clutch the blankets, her eyes wide and glossy as she whispered that it was climbing. She described the sensation with a trembling voice, how the thing inside her no longer stayed rooted in her womb but crept higher, inch by inch, pressing against her ribs, making her heart race frantically in her chest. Sometimes she felt it coil beneath her lungs, squeezing until she struggled for breath. Other times it settled near her collarbone, creating a visible swell beneath the skin, a bulge that moved with a sickening slowness before sinking back down into the obscurity of her torso. The doctor witnessed these shifts with a growing horror he tried desperately to hide. He had delivered dozens of infants in his lifetime. He knew the rhythm of fetal movement, the gentle flutters, the strong kicks in the later months. What he felt beneath her skin bore no resemblance to any of it. This was not instinctive motion but deliberate exploration, as though the creature was mapping the inside of its host, learning the boundaries of her body with cold curiosity. More than once, when he placed his hand on her abdomen, the movement beneath paused for a heartbeat, then pressed back against him with a chilling sense of awareness. Not a kick, not a reflex, but a slow, sliding push that made his stomach twist. The girl's appearance changed with equal strangeness. Her skin grew paler, almost translucent, revealing faint blue lines winding beneath the surface like new veins forming in unnatural patterns. Her breaths became shallow, strained, as if her organs were being compressed by the intruder's upward crawl. She confessed that sometimes she felt it reach her throat, creating an unbearable pressure that made swallowing difficult, as though it were testing how close it could get to her voice. Once, during a particularly violent episode, she gagged and clutched her neck, convinced it was trying to rise all the way up. The doctor tried to reassure her, but each night he sat in the corner of the cabin, unable to sleep as he listened to her ragged breaths and the faint internal movement that rustled inside her like something alive and searching. He no longer questioned whether it was alive. His only question was how long her body could withstand the unnatural path it traveled and what it intended to do once it reached the place it seemed to be climbing toward with unsettling purpose. The forest surrounding the girl's cabin began to change in ways so subtle at first that the villagers blamed the late-season winds or the shifting weather. But the doctor, who spent long nights awake listening to the girl's labored breathing, noticed the changes with a growing unease that settled in his stomach like a stone. The animals were the first to react. Deer that once wandered the edges of the clearing vanished entirely. Birds no longer perched on the cabin roof or nearby branches, their songs grew sparse, then stopped altogether. Even the insects, which had always thrived in the damp underbrush, seemed to avoid the area, leaving behind an unnatural quiet that pressed against the ears like cotton. Each morning, the doctor found new signs that the forest was withdrawing. The trail leading to the settlement became cluttered with broken twigs and overturned soil, as if small creatures had fled in a frenzy. The trees closest to the cabin began to bend, not in the direction of prevailing winds, but away from the girl's home, their trunks tilting as though trying to distance themselves from something they sensed but could not escape. Bark peeled from their surfaces in thin, curling strips, exposing pale wood beneath. Some trees bore darkened streaks running down their sides, as if touched by an unseen hand that left behind a residue of decay. The villagers spoke in hushed voices about the sounds drifting from the woods at night. The cries that once echoed faintly now carried a sharper edge, closer, clearer, no longer wandering through the distant treeline but circling the clearing with predatory patience. These sounds no longer mimicked an infant. They had grown deeper, layered, fluctuating in pitch in a way that made listeners feel watched. A few brave souls dared approach the edge of the forest at dusk, but they returned pale and shaken, claiming the shadows between the trees seemed to move against the lantern light, writhing as though something slithered just out of sight. The doctor felt the shift most acutely within the cabin. The air grew heavier each night, thick with a pressure that made the walls creak softly as if bearing the weight of a silent presence pressing inward. The girl would flinch at every rustle outside, insisting she heard the trees whisper, warning her, calling to her, or begging her to come deeper into the woods. She began to wake with soil under her nails despite never leaving the bed. Footprints, her size but not her gait, appeared outside the cabin, leading from the forest to her door and then vanishing entirely. As the creature inside her climbed higher within her body, the forest seemed to recoil in tandem, reacting to its progress with instinctive dread. It was as if the natural world recognized something the humans refused to admit. Whatever had chosen the girl as its vessel did not belong to these woods, yet it had grown strong enough that everything living within them felt the quiet terror of its nearing emergence. The night the storm rolled in, the air around the cabin felt charged, humming with a tension that made the doctor's skin prickle before a single raindrop fell. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, and the woods seemed to implode into darkness, as if the world were holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the girl lay curled on her side, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. She had grown weaker over the past days, unable to stand without trembling, her skin clammy and nearly translucent. Yet her eyes were wide, fever-bright, fixed on the door as though she sensed something approaching long before the doctor did. When the first clap of thunder shook the cabin, she cried out, only this time it wasn't from fear, but from an agonizing pressure radiating through her body with a strength that made her spine bow sharply. The doctor rushed to her side, expecting the familiar pattern of pain, but this was different. Her entire torso was shifting in violent pulses, as if whatever lived inside her was now struggling against confinement, desperate to escape. He had prepared tools as best he could, though he had no idea what good they would do. The girl's breath came ragged, her fingers clawing at the blankets as she gasped that it was coming, not like a child but like something forcing its own path, choosing its own exit. He tried to help her into a position used for delivery, but she doubled forward, curling over her abdomen as though protecting herself from within. The lantern light flickered wildly, shadows dancing across the walls in frantic bursts as her body tightened, then convulsed. She screamed a wordless sound that cut through the thunder, and the doctor saw her skin stretch unnaturally along her lower torso, not outward but downward and sideways, as if the creature was forcing its way toward a place the human body was never meant to open. Her breathing turned wet and shallow, her face twisted in agony. The doctor pressed towels to the areas where her skin strained, terrified that applying pressure might provoke the creature but knowing he had no other options. The air filled with a low vibrating hum, a sound that didn't come from her throat or the storm but from inside her, resonating through the wooden floorboards like a trapped voice struggling to take shape. The girl clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin as she whispered that she could feel its thoughts, cold, ancient, intent on release. Each convulsion grew stronger, more purposeful, and he realized he was no longer assisting a birth but witnessing the forced emergence of something that rejected every law of nature he had ever trusted. The lightning struck so close the cabin shuddered, and with that flash came a final, violent movement from within her, a decisive shift that told him the moment he had dreaded was no longer approaching. It was beginning. The storm's fury reached its peak as the doctor realized the creature inside her was no longer simply trying to escape, it was calling to something outside. The walls vibrated with each thunderclap, but beneath that natural chaos throbbed a deeper resonance, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to answer the hum emanating from within the girl's body. She writhed on the bed, her limbs trembling uncontrollably as she whispered that the voices were no longer confined to her mind. They were outside now, echoing through the forest, circling the cabin, speaking in the same layered tones that had tormented her for weeks. The doctor heard them too, muffled at first, like distant chanting carried by the storm winds, then clearer, rising and falling with a cadence that made the lantern flame twist violently as though recoiling. Shadows outside the cabin window shifted in a way that didn't align with the lightning's flashes, elongating and retreating, stretching like figures with impossible limbs gathering just beyond the reach of the lantern light. The doctor felt the weight of their presence pressing against the walls, a cold awareness that seeped through the cracks of the cabin as though seeking the girl with purposeful intent. Inside, the girl's torment escalated. She clutched at her throat, choking on her own breath as a bulge pressed against her skin from within, rising upward as if the creature sought to crawl through her voice. Her voice broke into a guttural sound not entirely her own, layered and discordant, a mimicry of the voices outside. For a moment, the doctor had the horrifying impression that she was speaking with something else's mouth, relaying a message she did not understand. The pressure in the room intensified, the air so thick he struggled to inhale, as though the very atmosphere were bending under an unseen force converging upon the cabin. The storm seemed almost secondary now, the true violence came from the invisible tide swelling around them, urging the creature within her to cross whatever threshold separated host from emergence. The floorboards creaked and groaned, not from the wind but from the unnatural energy gathering around her bed, pulsing in tandem with the movement beneath her skin. She gasped that it was close, that something in the woods was waiting for it, calling it, guiding it. Her body arched once more, her skin tightening as though stretched by unseen fingers, and the doctor realized with chilling clarity that the storm had not brought the creature to this moment. It had come because the creature was ready to answer whatever waited in the darkness outside.